There are few who don't know of the misty Isle of Skye, Mecca for tourists from all over the world. Each summer they arrive in their thousands to pay awe to the Cullens and pay homage to an island packed with history and romance. But till recently, few of those tourists bothered to look at the parish of Durnish, far less the village of Calbost, lying over the water from Dunvegan and staring west at the Outer Hebrides. Here, in a parish where the Gaelic songs sing of tough, brave men, one young man realized some ambitions.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to celebrate the opening of this old mill. This mill that has been closed, forgotten, and in a state of ruin for half a century. The idea of restoring the mill was born in the imagination of Peter and Joy McCaskill.
So huil mi gahaj agus kiarna onenyon ya khatrim vai harora da kerna toy snaraji noch kaken so hask mi leshnon go futin suyes hockey ambulosken removios.
The countryside of Skye is as bold and romantic as those black houses, thatched houses made black by peat smoke. The songs of Skye are romantic about bravery and boldness, as that one which sings of the young, bold men of Glendale, one of the areas of that little-known parish of Durnish.
Free the ball, hey for this time. Hey, wait about here, hit it quickly. 70, mid, 73, 2, 3, 4.
The men who live in Durnish today are tough, leathery-faced characters who eke a living from a minuscule farming known as crofting. As often as not, their living comes from social security. One young man decided that the tourists enriching the rest of the island of Skye should be encouraged to invest their spending money in the island's real historic past. 28-year-old Peter McCaskill. Peter is a crofter like his fellows, but he is the descendant of 4 generations of men and women who fought for the freedom to live their independent lives. He is poetically but unsentimentally conscious of those past generations and his own heritage.
I first took an interest in forming a museum when my wife opened a tea room at our home. She wanted various relics, local relics, to put on the wall, and I began collecting various things such as spinning wheels, cast room, and any relics pertaining to the area. And I got so many that we couldn't house them in the tea room, so that we decided we'd form a Black House Museum. It was our old family house where my grandfather was born and brought up. The idea was really to create a home as it would have been lived in at that time. We had to find cooking utensils, such as the pots, the different sizes of kettles, girdles, and tongs, and anything at all to do with a fire. Then we had to get a dresser to put all the dishes, and then we had to get some collected dishes to put on display on the dresser, and it involved getting the old-fashioned rolling pins, potato mashers, spoons, pipes, egg cups, etc. After we had completed the collection of dresser, then it's a question of finding a suitable table. And this proved very, very difficult. because most of the tables that had been used in the crofts had either been broken up or put outside where they rotted in due course. We got butter churns, which were used at that time, and I got a variety of 3. And then we got walking sticks. We had to get some walking sticks, and of course we had to get a spinning wheel, which no Highland home would have been complete without, and wool cards for carding the wool, and a crochet for winding the wool. The reason I began to collect for the museum was this, that I felt a lot of the relics were being bought by the English visitors and taken away from Skye. And a day would come when the young generation of the island would appreciate what their forefathers would have used in the block houses. But I'm very glad to say that by going round all the crofts and collecting as many things as I could, that I feel this will help future generations to appreciate as to how their forefathers would have lived in their Highland surroundings.
The calm, deserted swathes of Glendale and Durinish now belie a vibrant, virulent past. Like so many Highland areas, this part of Skye was crucified for Prince Charlie's abortive efforts of 1745. The glens were ravished, and instead of the old clan chiefs, new incomer landlords took over. Their interest was in lucrative sheep farming. Sheep farming could not exist along with reasonably dense population, so the people had to go.
Hush, hush, time to be sleeping, hush, hush. Dreams come a-creeping, dreams of peace and of freedom, so smile in your sleep, bonny baby. Once our valleys were ringing with sounds of our children singing, but now sheep bleat in the evening, and sheilings stand empty and broken. Hush.
The forefathers of Glendale risked their meagre all to guarantee a future for their descendants. When landlordism became oppressive beyond endurance, they formed the historic Land League and drummed up national support when they refused to pay rent for their scraps of land and lack of rights. And thus they faced the threat of brutal eviction, such as had already decimated vast areas of northern Scotland, as the natives were shipped abroad to live or die according to their luck.
Our men, once so fearless in battle, now stand cowed, huddled like cattle, and wait to be shipped o'er the ocean. Hush, hush.
At last came government action, but predictably not on behalf of the people of Glendale. In 1844, a man-of-war anchored at the foot of Peter McCaskill's croft, his grandfather's croft at that time. Grandfather was 4 years of age then, but vividly recalled the times to grandson Peter, thus forging a link between past and future. The soldiers, however, had little stomach for their job, and the Glendale dwellers won a martyr's battle.
All hopes of staying, hush, hush, the anchor's away, don't cry in your sleep, bonny baby. Hush, hush, time to be sleeping, hush, hush. Dreams come a-creeping, dreams of peace and of freedom, so smile in your sleep, bonny baby.
The Skye men won the moral victory, and the Glendale martyrs have left their stamp on their descendants. But Glendale and the parish of Durinish still suffer, not from landlordism now, but from an isolation which breeds low employment and high costs of import of the sheer necessities. Peter MacAskill set out to make local sense out of tourism, and in the first summer of his museum, 16,000 people called there at 25 pence per head. Peter's sense of the historic does not lack a sense of the practical, but tourists to Skye are by their nature more romantically inclined. They wanted to know, optimistically, where they could taste Skye's famous home brew, whiskey that used to flow from the forgotten illicit stills.
I decided that I would reconstruct one at the back of the museum, which proved quite a task, as people who had an illicit still, which they didn't use, they weren't prepared to give it, as they would be liable to prosecution. So we had to get one made in Glasgow. The Customs and Excise were very apprehensive about the whole idea, as they thought it would encourage local people to make their own whiskey, which would mean a loss of revenue to Her Majesty's government. And they did everything in their power to prevent me from setting up a replica of an illicit still. Making whiskey is a long and complicated affair, but the first item or ingredient one has to get is a bag of barley. After you're satisfied that it's completely dry and quite brittle, you then crush it and put it into a barrel of water. And then you add half 3 tins of treacle, half stone of sugar, and a stone of mashed potatoes, cold potatoes. And then you add 3 pounds of brewer's yeast, and you leave it to ferment for 3 days until it's quite flat. And then after that process, then it is ready for distilling. This is where you put the mash in, and then you light a peat fire underneath and boil it until you get a vapor that comes along this pipe down here to this barrel, which is full of cold water, and it condenses in the copper coil and comes out as a liquid spirit into the piquet on the floor down here.
The moorland water of Glendale is not, or regretfully perhaps, allowed to be converted into whiskey. You can make beer for your own consumption. You can make alcohol for the making of your own homemade wine. But unless an enlightened inland revenue system develops a sense of humor for the essentials, you cannot make your own whiskey. It would be facetious to attempt to link MacAskill's whiskey interest with his new interest in Skye water, but after his success with the museum and the still, his mind was beginning to search for other ideas.
The next thing I did was to begin restoring an old mill at Glendale. The mill was working up until 1914, and after 20 years the roof was sold, and then another 10 years transpired and the millstones were removed to Hamra Lodge, much to the older generation's horror. And the first step was to re-roof the mill and re-roof the kiln, which took approximately 3 weeks to complete. I was very lucky to have met Mr. Turner from Glasgow, who, after I had told him about the project in Glendale, that they would undertake to repair and restore the machinery at his factory in Glasgow, and that he would do this free of charge. or at cost price.
That same Mr. Turner has since admitted that had he known the enormity of the task, he would have had second thoughts. He had to put one of his oldest and most experienced men onto the job of reconstructing a wheel that had been made 2 centuries before he was born. In Skye, the job was to recover the granite grinding stones, pillaged to be part of an ornamental garden in Hamera Lodge. The reconstructed and the resurrected were beginning their journeys to come together. The technologists were weaving their cast iron way by Loch Lomond. The locals, more laboriously, were weaving their way to the old mill. At dawn on a May morning, the men who remembered the days when the grinding stones were grinding corn met together with Peter McCaskill, and the engineers from Glasgow completed their long haul. The granite stones, which had resisted wear and tear of weather, were coming together with the ironwork which had not. The descendants of the old Skye martyrs were taking back their inheritance.
All right, now.
The restored and the unspoilt were coming together.
Yes, well, you're going to go back. There a wee bit. Right.
The 3 projects now completed are important for 2 reasons. First, as a contribution to the preservation of some part of our cultural heritage. Secondly, these enterprises are giving work to some of the people in the Glen, where there is much unemployment, and that is certainly commendable. This mill is not just another museum piece, but a viable concern which can produce oatmeal to be sold to all comers. Perhaps the restoration of this old mill may symbolize the renewal of life in this place. I have very much pleasure in declaring the mill open.
McCaskill's third dream was achieved. The old mill wheel was turning, and in preparation for the wedding of raw grain and stone, the old kiln was waiting. That same kiln, again in operation, baking grain as it did for 150 years before it hiccuped and stopped for half a century. The restored machinery and the old stones again pounded grain. A sight for tourists, but a practical proposition as well if you like oatmeal porridge and brose. What makes a 28-year-old man of obvious drive stay and labor in what is by any standards a depressed, if admittedly beautiful area of Skye?
I elected to stay in Skye because all the time I have been away from the island, I homesick and pining to get back to my own land. And when I got my opportunity, I did so. And I feel now that I would never leave the island, regardless of what my financial situation was.